Princess was in their bedroom, searching through Bernard's things, when her fingers brushed against something tucked away in the back of a drawer. Pulling it out, she saw it was a worn envelope, thick with documents. Curiosity quickly turned to horror as she skimmed through it, her pulse quickening. There, in her trembling hands, lay proof her husband, Bernard, was legally married to his so-called sister, Jane, and both their names were on a passport, with Jason's. She felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Just then, she heard footsteps. Bernard and Jane entered the room, Jane carrying Jason in her arms. Bernard noticed the documents clutched tightly in Princess's hand. "What are those?" he asked, his voice low. "And why are you looking at me like that?" Princess didn't answer, her eyes wide with disbelief, fixed on the two of them. Bernard stepped forward, snatching the papers from her hands. His eyes darted across the pages, and he clenched his jaw. "What are you doing with this?" he demanded. Princess's voice was barely a whisper. "Were you both planning to run away with my child?" "What do you mean?" Bernard asked, a hint of defensiveness in his tone. "What do I mean? There's a passport here with all your names, yours, Jane's, and Jason's, as Mr. and Mrs. Davison. Not Austin. Why would that be?" She took a shaky breath, her voice cracking. "Wait. Are you two married?" Bernard's expression shifted, a flicker of something dark. "What are you even talking about?" "Don't lie to me!" Princess yelled, her voice breaking. She cried. "Is that why you hit me last week? Because of her?" Tears began to fall as she remembered the pain, both physical and emotional. Jane's face twisted with disdain. "Oh, please," she sneered, her voice rising. "What are you going to do about it? Do you think Bernard will choose you over me? If you weren't carrying our child, I'd throw you out myself." She turned to Bernard, wrapping her arm around him possessively and planting a kiss on his cheek. "Yes, he's my husband. My beloved husband." "What?" Princess gasped, feeling her heart shatter. Jane's mouth curved into a mocking smile. "Now that you know, you've actually made this easy for us. Just give birth to that child, and we'll be on our way." Bernard turned as if to leave, guiding Jason by the hand toward Jane's room. Princess, her voice broken, reached out. "Bernard. Please, what about us? You wedded me, you put this ring on my hand." She looked down, searching desperately for his own ring, for any sign of the man she thought he was. His patience snapped. "Will you leave me alone?" He spat, shoving her back onto the couch, his hand closing around her throat. She gasped for air, her vision blurring as his grip tightened. Jane's voice broke through the tension. Soft but with a smirk, "Bernard. Don't. She's pregnant, remember?" With a glare, Bernard released her, watching her slump against the couch, gasping for air. "From now on, you don't leave this house. Do you understand?" He turned away, pulling Jason closer. "Jason!" Princess choked out, reaching a hand toward her son, her heart breaking as she saw him led away. But Bernard's cold voice echoed back. "He's coming with us." Princess stared, unable to process the nightmare her life had become. Princess lost her parents when she was 10 years old in a terrible accident. The whole family, her mom, dad, and older brother, were going out to celebrate her dad's new business success. which had made him a billionaire. But on the way, they had a car crash, and everyone died except for Princess. She was in shock for over 3 months because of how bad the accident was. While Princess was in the hospital, her dad's family sold all her father's properties, saying it was to pay for the burial and her hospital bills. But in reality, they shared everything among themselves, leaving Princess with just the house her family were living in. They said because she was a girl, she cannot handle her father's property. When Princess finally got out of the hospital, she was taken to her father's older sister, Mrs. Udeh. Mrs. Udeh had 3 kids, 2 boys and a girl named Ruth, who was just 1 year younger than Princess. Since Mrs. Udeh and her husband lived in a rented house, they moved into the house that Princess' family had lived in. 3 months after Princess started living with Mrs. Udeh, something terrible happened again. Mr. Udeh collapsed suddenly while at work. Mrs. Udeh got a call saying he had collapsed while working. Before she could get to the hospital, her husband had already passed away. Everyone was sad, and Princess went to comfort her aunt. But instead of accepting her help, Mrs. Udeh pushed her away, calling her a witch. She blamed Princess for her family's deaths, and said Princess was trying to kill her family too. Mrs. Udeh told Princess to leave her house, but the family reminded her that the house they were living in actually belonged to Princess. They said Princess had nowhere else to go, so she could not leave. Mrs. Udeh was not happy about this. She decided to make life hard for Princess, to punish her for her husband's and brother's deaths. She treated Princess badly, to the extent that sometimes people outside had to give Princess food, because Mrs. Udeh would not give her food for days. One day Princess came across her late mother's friends while hawking sachet water on the road. The woman felt sorry for Princess and gave her a scholarship to finish secondary school, because Mrs. Udeh refused to send her to secondary school. That's how Princess was able to finish her secondary education. After school every day, Princess would go to the market to sell soda and sachet water. Some people who knew her sad story would give her a little money to help. But sometimes, Mrs. Udeh would search Princess' bag, take any money or valuable things she found, and still accuse Princess of stealing and even beat her. When Princess was 20 years old, one of Mrs. Udeh's friends, who lived in Abuja, came over to Lagos to visit Mrs. Udeh. She went to see Mrs. Udeh at her small shop in the market where she sells provision. When Princess came to collect soda and sachet water to sell, Mrs. Udeh's friend Gloria saw her and asked, "Is that your daughter?" Mrs. Udeh replied, "God forbid! That can never be my daughter. She's a witch." Princess, who was standing by the fridge, began to cry silently, as she heard her aunt reject her. Then she left to continue hawking. After she left, Mrs. Udeh's friend Gloria continued, "You know you're just wasting this fine girl. She could actually make you a rich woman." Mrs. Udeh, surprised, asked, "How would that smelly thing make me rich?" "Let me explain," Mrs. Gloria replied. "I have this friend who's married to a wealthy man, but they live in America. They've been married for 8 years without a child. They're looking for a surrogate who won't disturb their lives. She told me if she can find a good Nigerian girl who will get pregnant for her husband and give them a child, even just one, they'll pay the girl a huge amount of money in dollars." "Are you serious?" Mrs. Udeh replied, looking both interested and shocked. But that do not help me. She's the one who'll get rich. And I'm not even sure if that witch would agree. She has too much pride, just like her mother. Mrs. Gloria paused for a moment, thinking. Let me tell you something, he said. You don't have to let her know the real plan. Just tell her you've found a husband for her. We can arrange a fake marriage, and then all the money comes to you. Mrs. Udeh hesitated, but Mrs. Gloria kept persuading and convincing her until she agreed. They contacted the couple in America and made a plan. The couple would come to Nigeria to make the arrangement look real. Mrs. Gloria also advised Mrs. Udeh to start taking better care of Princess, so that she would look attractive when the couple would come to see her. From that day on, Mrs. Udeh changed her behavior towards Princess. She started treating Princess very well, calling her my gold. Her children were shocked, and even Princess was surprised by the sudden change. She thought maybe Mrs. Gloria had advised her aunt in the shop, not knowing that they had already sold her out. Mrs. Udeh's daughter, who used to call Princess a witch, was scolded by her mother. She was told never to use that word again on Princess. Mrs. Udeh even told her to call Princess by her real name. Princess now ate with the family at the dining table. Mrs. Udeh also divided the household chores equally among the children, except for her oldest son, who was already in the university. Few months later, the couple from America arrived in Nigeria. They visited Mrs. Udeh and other to meet Princess. Everything had already been arranged and planned. Mrs. Gloria pretended to be the couple's auntie. They made up a story that their parents were late and introduced the couples as siblings. Mrs. Gloria lied to Princess, saying the moment she saw Princess, she loved her and thought she would make a great wife for her cousin. She praised Mrs. Udeh for raising Princess so well. The couple also introduced themselves using fake names. They introduced their names as Jane and Bernard Austin. After they left, Mrs. Udeh did her best to convince Princess, saying that Mrs. Gloria truly loved her and had been the one buying all the expensive items and food they had been eating. She said that was why she stopped mistreating her, and warned Princess not to disappoint Mrs. Gloria. She even threatened that if Princess refused, she would go back to her old ways of treating her. Or even worse. Princess felt confused. That evening, she secretly called her close friend, Darasimi, who was the son of her secondary school principal. They were very much in love with each other. Darasimi had promised Princess that once he finished his master's degree, he would come and marry her. She shared everything that was happening with him. Darasimi advised her to either wait for him or run away from the house, saying he would send her money. However, Princess did not fully trust Darasimi's promises. She thought to herself that Darasimi had met many intelligent and beautiful ladies. So why would he choose her? Princess was too afraid of her aunt and refused Darasimi's advice. Every weekend, Jane would come over to Mrs. Udeh's house, take Princess out shopping, and buy her lots of gifts. They gave her the latest iPhone, designer clothes, and took her to fancy hotels and restaurants. Jane and Bernard even promised her that after their marriage, Princess was overwhelmed by all the gifts and promises, so much so that she did not notice the red flags. One day, after returning from a shopping trip with Jane, Princess overheard Mrs. Udeh explaining to her daughter Ruth, because she was jealous of Princess, that the marriage was not real, and they would be the ones to get rich, not Princess. that she should not be jealous of Princess. Princess heard part of the conversation, but her aunt quickly changed the topic when she walked in, acting as though she had been talking about someone else. Princess brushed it off, thinking it could not possibly be about her. 2 months later, the fake marriage took place. When Princess arrived at the church, she was shocked to see only her aunt and 2 of her children, Ruth and his junior brother, Mrs. Gloria, Bernard, Jane and the pastor, and some few people she has never met before. She became afraid and asked her aunt, "Why is none of our family members around?" Her aunt made up a story. She became uncomfortable with the whole thing and told her aunt she does not want to marry again. Mrs. Gloria, seeing Princess' reaction, called Jane and Bernard to come over to beg Princess. Later, Princess agreed and they got married, and Princess moved into the house that Jane and Bernard had bought. Mrs. Udeh and Mrs. Gloria received a large sum of money as part of the deal.
What would be Princess' fate after the marriage? Would she and Bernard fall in love and live happily? Or would things become worse than before? Well, watch out for part 2. Subscribe to our channel so that you'll get notified once the part 2 drops. Thanks for watching.